There's something different about people who remember the milkman. Maybe it's the way they trust routine without needing to control every variable. Maybe it's how they navigate uncertainty with calm competence. Maybe it's that they understand community operates on rhythms deeper than transactions. Because remembering milk delivery didn't just mean you're old enough to recall glass bottles. It forged a specific type of psychological resilience that experts are only now beginning to understand. And by the end of this video, you're going to see why this experience created some of the most adaptable people alive today. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong. Modern culture assumes convenience always equals progress. But people who remember milk delivery prove that theory dead wrong. Picture yourself as a 7-year-old waking up on a Tuesday morning in 1978. The house is still dark, but there's a sound you recognize instantly, the gentle clink of glass on your front porch. You pad barefoot to the door, careful not to wake anyone, and crack it open to the cool morning air. There they are. 2 glass bottles, condensation beating on their sides, metal caps pressed tight, cream rising thick at the top. You bring them inside, the glass cold against your small hands, and set them in the refrigerator. The milkman has already moved on to the next house, his truck idling somewhere down the street. You never saw him, but you trusted he'd come, and he always did. Picture this. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, before dawn, before your parents stirred, you're 8 years old and you're learning something profound about how the world works through milk bottles you never ordered yourself. This wasn't just convenient home delivery, it was your first lesson in systems thinking. You learned to trust processes you couldn't see or control. The milkman came whether you watched for him or not. He knew your family's needs without being told every time. The empty bottles you left out disappeared and returned full. Psychologists call this developing an internal locus of control combined with secure attachment to community systems. But for you, it was just Tuesday. Here's what's remarkable. You were building executive function through something as mundane as dairy delivery. You learned cause and effect across time. Actions had consequences that appeared on a schedule you couldn't manipulate. Kids today track their Amazon packages obsessively, refreshing delivery windows every 10 minutes. They need constant updates because they've learned systems are unpredictable. But you internalized something different. This wasn't dependence, it was calibrated trust. Picture this. Summer afternoon, 1981. You're 10 years old, carrying 4 glass milk bottles from the porch to the kitchen. Each one weighs more than a pound, slippery with condensation, and you know exactly what happens if you drop them. This wasn't your parents being lazy, it was daily practice in consequence management. You learned to move carefully with fragile things, to plan your grip before you lifted, to understand that some mistakes can't be undone. Broken glass and spilled milk taught you both permanently. Neuroscientists call this developing frustration tolerance through graduated challenges, but for you, it was just helping out. Here's what's remarkable. You were learning executive function through something as mundane as dairy delivery. You learned risk assessment with real stakes, not video game stakes, not try-again stakes, real broken glass and real consequences. Modern kids grow up with plastic everything, designed to survive drops and impacts. They're protected from breakage because we decided fragility was too dangerous, but you learned to handle delicate things successfully. This wasn't carelessness, it was earned competence. Picture this. Thursday evening, and you open the refrigerator to find the milk nearly gone. The next delivery isn't until Saturday morning. You're 11 years old, doing the math in your head, calculating ratios of cereal to milk, planning breakfast portions. This wasn't deprivation, it was your introduction to delayed gratification in resource management. You learned to make things last, to adjust consumption based on availability, to plan ahead because you couldn't just get more instantly. Psychologists call this building emotional self-regulation through natural scarcity, but for you, it was just being smart. Here's what's remarkable. You developed impulse control not through rewards and punishment, but through natural feedback loops. Want more milk? Wait. Want it now? Adjust. Today's generation opens food delivery apps 17 times a day. They've never had to wait for Saturday because anything arrives in 30 minutes, but you learned patience had its own rhythm. This wasn't suffering, it was adaptation. Picture this. You're 9 years old and your mother is sick with the flu. She hasn't put out the milk order note, but Friday morning there's an extra bottle on the porch anyway. The milkman noticed the pattern change and adjusted. This wasn't surveillance, it was community intelligence in action. You learned that people paid attention without being asked, that neighbors knew neighbors through observation and care, that commerce and community weren't separate categories. Neuroscientists call this developing social intelligence through ambient awareness, but for you, it was just Mr. Henderson being thoughtful. Here's what's remarkable. You were learning to read subtle social cues and reciprocate care through mundane interactions. The milkman noticed. Your mother would thank him next time. This was how relationships worked. Modern kids interact with delivery drivers they never see behind Ring cameras and locked doors. They've learned transactions are anonymous because we decided personal connection was inefficient, but you learned business could be human. This wasn't nosiness, it was mutual investment. Picture this. It's 1979 and you're 7 years old. Your parents have given you one job: bring in the milk before you leave for school. No reminders, no backup plan. If you forget, the bottles sit in the sun and spoil. This wasn't child labor, it was your first experience with consequences that extended beyond you. You learned that your action, or inaction, affected the whole family, that responsibility meant remembering without being reminded, that some tasks had time-sensitive stakes. Psychologists call this building executive function through authentic responsibility, but for you, it was just your job. Here's what's remarkable. You were 7, entrusted with something that actually mattered. Not a gold star, not screen time, real food that real people needed. Kids today have chore charts with reward systems, reminder apps, and parents who double-check everything. They've learned responsibility means compliance when monitored, but you learned it meant ownership. This wasn't burden, it was agency. Picture this. Saturday morning, 1977. You're 6 years old, watching thick cream separate and rise to the top of fresh milk. Your mother shakes the bottle, and you watch the cream disappear back into the liquid, then slowly begin its rise again. This wasn't just a dairy lesson. It was watching natural processes unfold in real time. You learned that things happen at their own pace, that you can't rush chemistry, that patience reveals transformation. Neuroscientists call this developing default mode network activity through observation of natural phenomena. But for you, it was just cool. Here's what's remarkable. You were learning systems thinking through breakfast, cause and effect, time and change, order emerging from chaos. Modern kids drink ultra-pasteurized, homogenized milk from plastic jugs where nothing separates or changes. They've never watched a natural process complete its cycle. But you saw transformation daily. This wasn't entertainment, it was education. Picture this. You're 8 years old, and it's your job to rinse the empty bottles and put them back in the carrier on the porch. You do it carefully, knowing the milkman will inspect them tomorrow, knowing dirty bottles mean consequences. This wasn't just chores. It was learning that systems are circular, not linear. You learned that consumption creates obligation, that what you used returned to someone else, that carelessness affected strangers you'd never meet. Psychologists call this developing environmental awareness and reciprocity norms, but for you, it was just being considerate. Here's what's remarkable. You were building ethical reasoning through daily practice. Your bottles became someone else's bottles. Your care mattered to people you'd never see. Today's generation knows everything is disposable. They've learned consumption ends with recycling bins because we decided return systems were too inconvenient. But you learned waste wasn't the endpoint. This wasn't guilt, it was stewardship. Picture this. Winter evening, 1980. Your mother is writing a note to the milkman. Please leave 1 extra quart this week. Company coming. She tucks it in the carrier, and you put it on the porch, trusting a message left in darkness will be found at dawn. This wasn't primitive communication. It was learning that some systems work on faith and trust. You learned that writing a note to someone you rarely saw still worked, that people honored agreements made through minimal contact, that reliability didn't require surveillance. Neuroscientists call this developing secure attachment to social contracts, but for you, it was just how things worked. Here's what's remarkable. You were building confidence in human systems without constant verification. The note would be found, the extra milk would appear. Trust was the default. Kids today grow up with read receipts and tracking numbers and confirmation emails. They've learned consumption ends with recycling bins because we decided return systems were too inconvenient. But you learned waste wasn't the endpoint. This wasn't guilt, it was stewardship. Picture this. January morning, 1982, and there's 8 inches of snow on the ground. You're 9 years old, bundling up to retrieve the milk bottles that are somehow impossibly still there on the porch, half buried but delivered. This wasn't just service, it was your lesson in commitment despite conditions. You learned that some people showed up regardless, that reliability meant consistency, not convenience, that your needs mattered enough for someone to work through difficulty. Psychologists call this building stress inoculation through witnessed perseverance. But for you, it was impressive. Here's what's remarkable. You internalized that keeping promises sometimes requires pushing through obstacles. The milkman could have skipped your street, but he didn't. Modern delivery services notify you of delays before they happen, teaching that conditions are valid excuses. They've learned systems fail predictably because we decided difficulty justified cancellation, but you learned commitment transcended comfort. This wasn't exploitation, it was dedication. Picture this, summer of 1985, and you're 12 when you notice the milk truck comes less frequently. Then it stops coming at all. The dairy closes, the glass bottles become collectibles, an entire system vanishes, and you're old enough to understand you witnessed something that won't return. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was learning that systems you trusted could end. You learned that progress eliminates as much as it creates, that convenience costs something, even if you can't name it at 12, that some losses are permanent. Neuroscientists call this developing complex grief for systemic change. But for you, it was just sad. Here's what's remarkable. You learned economic and social forces beyond your control shape your world. You learned adaptation isn't always choice. You learned to hold both gratitude for what was and acceptance of what is. Kids today never form attachments to systems because everything changes constantly. They've learned nothing is permanent because we decided stability was impossible. But you learned to grieve progress. This wasn't resistance, it was wisdom. But some experiences cut deeper. Consider this. You're 10 years old on a Saturday morning in 1980, and your father has died suddenly. The funeral was yesterday. The house is heavy with grief and confusion and relatives speaking in hushed voices. You wake up, disoriented, to that familiar sound, the gentle clink of glass on the porch. You go to the door, moving through shock, and there are the milk bottles, same as always. The milkman came. The world kept turning. Somehow, this ordinary miracle breaks something open inside you. Grief, yes, but also the understanding that life continues, that systems persist beyond individual tragedy, that someone you've never met still cared enough to do their job on the morning after your world ended. This imprinted a profound truth. Consistency is a form of care. But that gift existed alongside something darker,
because milk delivery also meant your mother had to budget carefully, had to make portions stretch, had to calculate costs against a limited weekly income. You watched her count coins for the milkman. You felt the tension when bills came. You learned that reliability also meant inflexibility. You got what was scheduled, not what you suddenly needed. That security had a price, often paid by people who couldn't afford it. This created people who hold both truths, comfort and constraint, gratitude and grief, trust and awareness that systems serve some better than others. This complexity might be their most valuable inheritance. Let's return to that Tuesday morning. You, barefoot, 7 years old, bringing glass bottles inside while your house still sleeps, the weight of them in your hands, the cold against your palms, the trust that they'd be there. These people carry something the modern world desperately needs. They remember milk delivered on rhythm, not demand, glass that required care, waiting that built patience, systems that worked on trust instead of surveillance, community embedded in commerce. They're living proof that resilience is built, not born. Competence comes from practice, not protection. The best gift isn't a smooth path, but the strength to walk an uneven one. Trust without constant verification is possible. In a world of instant gratification, tracked packages, and disposable everything, they stand as evidence of another way. Not perfect, not without costs, but a way that produced people who can wait without anxiety, trust without verification, handle fragile things successfully, and understand that the most important systems work quietly. They grew up in an era when milk arrived before dawn, delivered by someone they rarely saw but always trusted. And somehow, they learned to hold it all. The weight of glass, the patience of waiting, the competence earned through real consequences, the faith that someone would show up in the darkness and leave exactly what was needed. That wasn't just milk delivery, that was learning how to live.